I'm going to talk a lot about my research, but only in terms of how it relates to the Shambhala Music Festival and harm reduction at festivals and the kind of harm reduction work that can be done, and that I think, certainly from what I've heard, that I think some of you are probably interested or may even be involved in. So a little bit about me. Bernie already mentioned. I guess the key things here are just that my research is on mainstream substance users. Most of the research that's out there is on marginalized populations, and so I feel like the great big middle gets left out of a lot of the work. And so both the volunteer work that I've done in the past and this my research is related to mainstream populations, which makes it a bit hard because people say, well, why bother? There's this sort of assumption that everybody, I think, either doesn't matter or is doing well, and I actually think that there's a lot that one can do. There's a thing in epidemiology called Rose's Theorem that says if you make a very small change in the health of a population, but it's a large population, that can actually have an incredibly big impact. And when you consider how small some of the marginalized populations are that huge amount of resources get put into, the total amount of benefit that's likely to come out of that is fairly limited, which is not to say they're undeserving in any way, and I don't mean to set up any competition, but just that my interest is really in making small changes that affect lots of people. And I'm also a member of the community that I'm researching. I've been a partier in the past. I've helped organize music festivals, been involved in doing lots of harm reduction outreach. So I'm going to talk with bias tonight. I'm not going to put on any kind of unbiased hat. Yeah, and I guess I'm average, older than your average party goer. So that's given me some perspective, I think. I don't know, maybe not. So to talk a little bit about harm reduction at festivals and raves and things, back in the 1980s when the electronic dance movement sort of began, there was the people who organized parties and festivals and things did put out some information. They may not have framed it as harm reduction information, but it was certainly information about how to have a better time, how not to get into trouble, how to help each other out. And back in 1992, which is a bit of a shock because you realize how long ago that was, the Netherlands started the Drug Information Monitoring System, and they were the very first ones who got out there with a really thorough monitoring system that addressed, the sort of club drugs and recreational drugs. But more than that, they actually started doing quantitative testing of drugs at parties and raves using a mobile laboratory, and then they would post pictures and they'd post results, and so they're still just without compare. That kind of service that they offer is just without compare, and they've been doing it now for over 20 years. And it's something that I really, really would love to see us happen here, or see us have here. And things may be slowly converging on making the possibility for something like that get a little bit better. So in 1998, DanceSafe, how many of you heard of DanceSafe? Okay, all of you, that's great. So DanceSafe started in the US, and actually, one of the people who got me involved in doing harm reduction was the couple who basically built DanceSafe. So I feel like I got a very good education there. Then in 2001, there was a very interesting document that the European Monitoring Center on drugs and drug abuse, horrible name, but they put out this inventory of on-site pill testing, and I think it was quite astounding to actually see how much work was going on and how much pill testing was occurring. You can download it off the EMCDDA website if you just look for inventory of on-site pill testing, and it's quite fascinating. In the 2000s, TRIP was an organization that started in Toronto. The same people who started TRIP came to Vancouver and began Mind, Body, Love, which is where I got involved. Ken, actually, sitting over there, was a very instrumental person in my career into harm reduction volunteering. And then there's the Vancouver, or the Island Kids actually were a really important group here. I don't think they're going anymore, but they were very important in the sort of recent early days of party harm reduction. Anchors in the Kootenays, they're an HIV/AIDS Hep C organization, but they also do the pill testing at Shambhala, and they have a really strong focus on harm reduction and public education. And the kind of thing that people, or the kind of harm reduction outreach that people were doing initially started with just information, pamphlets, brochures. I don't know if you've seen the DanceSafe cards. But the problem with information is that I think in the early day there was this assumption that if you knew something, then you would do it. And of course, there's a big gap between knowing and actually doing. And so we started out by doing information tabling, but we always ended up talking to the people who already had all the answers. And so we thought maybe we should start trying something a little more innovative. And drug-facilitated sexual assault was kind of a current issue in the party scene at that time. So we thought, well, we'll make a safe space that the girls can come to when it gets a little too heavy out there. But so we set up a chill space. We made it really nice and kind of a little psychedelic, and we had glow in the, UV reactive coloring in books and pamphlets and stuff like that. And the idea was, make a nice space people could come to and chill out. And maybe while that was happening, we would chat to them a little bit about drugs, about drug use, and how they were doing, and so on. So, much to our surprise, the place filled up with teenage boys almost every time we did it. And it turned out that they just wanted to have a really good time, and they weren't always into hitting on girls or hitting on boys or dancing. They sometimes just wanted to sit down and color in and enjoy their high. So that kind of opened a bit of a door. And at the same time, I was doing my master's degree in liberal studies, just sort of for the hell of it. And I was studying constructivist learning theory and sort of liberatory education. And it struck me that there was maybe some connection between the two. And in particular, what I really liked was this idea of constructivism, that it isn't meaningful to talk about an inherent you, that you perform a you in an environment, and that you is evoked. And so there's some sort of conversation with the environment that goes on. So I thought, what if we changed the environment? So people just turned up, did what they did, but because the environment was different, it turned out differently. And so if constructivism was really true in some real way, then maybe that would work. And the shocking thing was it really did work, and it worked very well, to the degree that it kind of was a little bit shaking in terms of thinking how much free will we might have when you realize how much you can actually influence people just in very, very subtle ways through how you lay a space out. Come on in, grab a seat. So the Burning Man community really pioneered this idea of rangers, which are kind of roving people with harm reduction supplies on them, and go out and keep an eye on what's going on in the party, help bring people back to resources if necessary, or summon resources to them if they're immobilized. And then, of course, pill testing, which was something that Dance Safe has really done a huge amount of, and which we've tried to do in the work that we did in BC, but we always seem to run afoul of the RCMP. One New Year's, we actually said, okay, there've been a bunch of kids who died from hyperthermia from too much ecstasy. We thought, we're ready to go to jail. We're going to do this outreach. We're going to do the pill testing. The promoter was willing to support us. And so when the cops came, the promoter was like, you're going to do what you're going to do, and this will make great headlines tomorrow. And when they came to talk to us, we said, we've got our bags packed. This will make great headlines tomorrow. And then they said, well, okay, we're not going to arrest you, but we'll arrest anyone you talk to. I'm like, all right. Truce. So we stopped testing drugs, but we ended up actually talking with the RCMP at that point. They invited us to a national policy conference on club drugs. And they were particularly taken with pill testing, and they wanted to know, why are we doing pill testing? It's a terrible thing. It doesn't provide any useful information. Why are we doing this? We're just encouraging people to take drugs. And so I'm telling you the story just to sort of link it to this constructivist idea, or this idea that how you set up an environment can profoundly affect people in it, even in ways you might not have, that may not be obvious. So people say, what's the point of pill testing? All it will tell you is whether there's ecstasy in a pill or not. It doesn't tell you whether it's good. It doesn't tell you necessarily what else is in there or how strong it is. And what we've discovered is when you have pill testing at a party, the dealers get more honest. They sell better drugs because they know that if they're going to sell a whole bag of pills to somebody for a lot of money, they're going to buy one, bring it over to the testing place, and if it doesn't have ecstasy or something in it, they're not going to buy the pills. So it tends to make the dealers more honest, which is really interesting. It introduces the very notion of testing your drugs into an environment. So for some people, they've never even thought about that. They didn't know it was possible. They never thought that it was something to do. Also, while people are having their pills or powder tested, they're in a very receptive moment and a very open moment to have a discussion about substance use, where they get their pills, how they use them, what their plan is for the evening, what do they know, and so on. And so you can see that what looks like the main point of doing pill testing, which doesn't seem terribly successful, is actually incredibly successful at all the other things that it leads to, all the things that lead to a healthier party environment. By the way, if you have any questions, just stop me at any point. So this is what the sanctuary, so we started, basically what happened was we applied to Health Canada for we were a bunch of hippies and music festival organizers who wanted to do this harm reduction outreach with chill spaces and things. And the Health Canada Drug Strategy Community Initiatives Fund put out a call for innovative programming. So we thought, well, they'll never go for this party stuff, but we'll write up something about teenagers, high school, whatever, and then we'll tuck this little thing on the side with a little bit of money to go around to do basically sanctuaries or chill spaces at festivals in BC. So they came back and said, oh, this high school stuff is really boring. Do you want to rewrite your grants and do it just about doing these sanctuaries? So that's what we did. It ended up giving us, I think it was $20,000 a year for 2 years. And with that, we were able to pay people to volunteer, pay for people to go to parties, move out, collect some supplies, move around the province and so on. And that's actually now become very, very successful. And this idea of the sanctuary is really this idea of altering the environment so that it becomes healthier overall in action. And now we've trained many hundreds of people in BC and Alberta. There's sanctuaries or chill spaces or safe spaces are now very common at festivals. And so if you guys are thinking of putting on a party, this is something that you can think about doing. Okay, so I guess, how many of you been to Shambhala? All right, awesome. So just super quickly, it started in 1998. It's been going for a very long time. It's small in world terms or in North American terms because there are a lot of 90,000, 100,000, 200,000 festivals. But certainly in Western Canada, it's one of the largest sort of electronic dance music festivals really focused on the scene that I think we're all connected to. And they were very, very receptive. They were kind of skeptical the first year we took the sanctuary up there. It was called the Cosmic Kiva back then. But when they saw the difference it made, they were like, we will never do a Shambhala again without one. And so a lot of the kind of refinement of the idea has been in conjunction with the organizers of Shambhala who really are amazing and are really concerned about providing a healthy environment. My research is around polysubstance use, and a lot of people go, huh? I generally prefer the term polysubstance use to polydrug use because people often have a very narrow idea of what a drug is, and really we want this to be more open. So what is the poly and polysubstance use? Well, it means two or more, essentially, at the same time. And then the question becomes, at what time? And so the majority of research out there when it talks about polysubstance use is actually talking about concurrent substance use. They have a question that says, in the last month, did you use any of the following? And then they have a whole bunch of check boxes, and if you check off more than two, then they call that polysubstance use. But it's concurrent, and we really, it doesn't, I think, necessarily mean anything metabolically if the period is not very short, because you could have a drink one weekend and smoke a doob another weekend and do some E the following weekend, and really are they all in your body at the same time? So that might be called concurrent substance use if you're asked about, or concurrent polysubstance use if you're being asked about what you did in the last month, and those were your last 3 weekends. What I'm much more interested in is simultaneous substance use, which is when the substances are actually in your body within a very short period of time. They're potentially all metabolically active at the same time, and they're interacting in ways that are going to change how they function. So that's what my study has been about, and that's a lot about what this presentation is about. And I think because this is how substance use is now changing, when we think about doing harm reduction to people who use drugs or people who use drugs in recreational settings, then this is what we need to think about. So we have a whole bunch of substances, and there's a bunch of things that can happen when they mix in your body. So the most basic is they're just in your body at the same time. They don't really mix with each other in any special way, other than you just get to enjoy the effects of both of them together. So maybe they might be doing something like ketamine and cocaine. Maybe ketamine makes you feel a little tired, you do some coke, you get up, or maybe if you've done a stimulant and you're near the end of your experience and you're still feeling jittery and up, you might smoke some weed to come down. So that's the idea of they're just in your system at the same time and not necessarily doing anything. But then you can have interactions, and because of the way the body metabolizes drugs and so on, these interactions can be of different kinds. And it isn't that one kind is good and one kind is bad, because you can actually use them in different ways. So antagonism is when two substances work against each other. So in that case, the one will maybe counteract the effects of the other. So you might take something that's a little bit of a downer when you take a lot of a stimulant. Because the stimulant's too much, maybe you're grinding your teeth or something like that, and so you take something to calm you down a bit. Can also be used to maintain function for longer, so people who like to drink and want to party for the whole weekend will do some cocaine at some point. Actually, that's a bad example, because that's going to go up there. Scratch that I said that. But you know the general idea. But what can also happen is, say if you're on antidepressants and then you do ecstasy, then the effect of the drug is much weaker. And so what can happen is people think they're on a weak drug, but really it's the interaction with something else in their body, and so they take more, and then they get all the side effects, the elevated body temperature and all the other things that can go bad with something, say, like ecstasy. On the other hand, you can actually use synergy, which is when the two interact to strengthen each other, to do something like have a bigger buzz, or have your buzz happen faster. You might make your experience last longer because you've got a whole long weekend and you're not just going to party for 6 hours, you're going to party for 18 hours or 24 hours. And then lastly, this one is the one we know the least about. It's when the drugs combine and actually form a new substance, and this is where my one and only example I can think of is alcohol and cocaine. And when you ingest both in your body at the same time, it actually forms a new compound called coca-ethyl in the liver. And coca-ethyl is a little more psychedelic than cocaine. The problem is it's also pretty liver toxic. So this is an area where I think we need a lot of new research, because now there's so much more of this mixing going on. Okay, so my research questions, which has sort of driven all of this, and essentially came out of the harm reduction work I was doing, but I always wanted to keep those two a little bit separate, is what are the contemporary patterns of substance use? Because it struck me that what people were doing now is very different from when I used to party, which was back then you would do a heroic dose of mushrooms or something and go play in the forest for 12 hours, and that was your night. And also the idea was you either were a drinker or you were into psychedelics, but the two worlds never crossed. And now it seems that everyone drinks before they get high. And so just even on that observation, the world has changed a bit. And then also, because I'm an epidemiologist, I'm not a psychologist or a sociologist, and because really what's driving my research is this looking for levers, looking for things we can actually do to change things, I was interested on just the individual social and environmental influences and not sort of internal stuff. As I mentioned, I'm just taking an epidemiological approach, and the purpose is really reducing the harms that can arise in mainstream populations from substance use in recreational venues. It's just such a huge mouthful. We call it recreational drug use. So there were 4 linked studies that were done. There was a feasibility survey in 2007, but actually that was really a bit of a disaster. So let's just say that there's 3 studies that are going to go into my PhD. So I'll touch on all of them, not necessarily separately. I'll combine them a bit. So this is what happened when I did a self-administered survey at Shambhala. And pretty fabulous. This is actually not a particularly outstanding example. There were quite a lot of surveys. People obviously were using them for all sorts of things, and obviously were very high when they did them. But what was great was this. We know, guys, we have the information you seek. And so I was not discouraged by that, but it struck me that self-administration was not the way to do kind of research in a party setting. So something had to change. So in 2009, I did a bunch of in-depth interviews, and I wanted to start out from this premise of even though I was somebody with experience using substances and I had my own ideas about what mattered to me, there wasn't much in the literature around this except this idea of peer pressure, your bad friend is going to make you do the drug you wouldn't otherwise do, and this idea that it's all about, if drugs are available, then people are going to do them, which we now know from Colorado is not the case. If anybody still believed that. So I wanted to do some interviews, starting with a very blank slate, and just ask people, the last time you used a bunch of drugs together, what was actually going on? And so I wanted to do it in mainstream populations, 19 plus for ethical UBC ethics reasons. And in order to be part of the study, you had to have used 2 or more drugs at the same time, at least monthly for 6 months. And I used something called a quest of view format. If there's any research geeks here, I can tell you about that later. It's not relevant now. And then we did some thematic analysis. We had these hour-and-a-half-long interviews. We transcribed them all. And then 3 of us went through them and encoded them and looked for themes and so on.
So, sorry, given that you're doing qualitative research here, how are you assessing the credibility of the results that you're getting there? Sorry, how are you assessing the credibility of the responses you're getting?
So this was just to inform the quantitative. This was just to sort of elicit what might be some social and environmental influences. It wasn't, deep grounded theory or anything like that. But I was sort of following in the spirit of grounded theory, and so I was analyzing the interviews as we were going and sort of changing the questions and changing what I was asking and checking things. If somebody had mentioned something, then I would check it later with somebody else and so on. And I'd actually reached a point where I really wasn't getting anything new once I'd hit about 10 interviews. But I thought it would be really nice to have equal numbers of men and women, so I went ahead and did 14. And then, so what came out of that was what the factors might be, the social and environmental factors that are influencing people's decision to, I shouldn't say decision, influencing the fact that they end up having used multiple drugs. And so that went into this questionnaire. This time we went back to Shambhala in 2009, and I had a team of 10 researchers, counting myself, and we interviewer administered it. So sat with the questionnaire so people could see it, but we actually asked the questions, filled in the answers. It was also a way to check that people were not too high, and that, if we'd ask them, were you high, or check their pupil size and all that, and they seemed relatively okay, maybe 30 minutes in, it would start getting really weird. And you'd know that maybe this wasn't great. And the other thing was we also did an oral, like a verbal consent. We didn't get people's signatures and names, which I think was pretty important. And if you are going to do research with drug users, it's important to think about how people might respond if you ask them to, give them your name and sign a form, and then you're going to talk about illegal activity for an hour. So the bits I'm going to cover are around the detailed drug use and then this piece here. And the thing to note is that this was community sampling all over the festival grounds. So you didn't have to be a substance user to participate. We didn't sample just in one area. And the reason I'm telling you this is to contrast it with what comes next. We really made an effort to cover the whole site and try and get as diverse a group of people as we could. So then in 2013, Anchors was interested in doing another survey there because they provide a lot of the harm reduction services. And so Anchors and I worked together, and we ended up putting it on my PhD ethics application and then using a bunch of the questions I'd already asked, and decided this might be a very interesting way of checking the data I had. But, and so I'll talk a little bit, actually I'm not going to talk about the pill testing, I'll talk a little bit about this. But the thing that's interesting is here we actually sampled from the Anchors lineup. So these are people who are lining up to use the Anchors booths either because they want drug information or pill testing or something like that. So this is a very different crowd, or you would think it would be a very different crowd. So to tell you a little bit about the in-depth interviews, there was 7 guys and 7 girls. They were pretty mainstream, fairly young, well-educated, mostly employed, and so on. And so this seemed like a really good group to feed into, or feed information into the quantitative survey. So the major themes that came out of this, some of them are a little bit obvious, but it's good to actually get this kind of confirmation, and then you're not just researching your own biases. So this idea of heightening or extending fun and pleasure, because it is about having a really good time. And I think this is one of the things that sometimes we're a little bit afraid to actually say, is it's great to get high. People have a hell of a lot of fun. I mean, it really sucks when it goes wrong, and it certainly could be better, but people have a really good time when they get high or when they get drunk. Millions of people do it every weekend or every night of the week. So this was an interesting one, was this idea of drug use as a skillful activity. And there was a lot of conversation about learning how to do it better, learning from experience, sharing knowledge amongst friends, and this idea that in the same way that you might do a sport, this is something you can get better at. And I'm going to touch on the concept of skillful psychonauts later. And then sharing, bonding, and mutual care was a very big one. And I think it's important to recognize this because this is what we can build on in terms of having how we as a communities of people who are part of the scene or connected with the scene can actually take care of each other or make the scene healthier is we really can build on that. And then also, leading from that, people talked about the spiritual side of it. So the sample population, mostly fairly young. This was from the two surveys of 2009 and 2013. They're very similar. Statistically, they were drawn from the same underlying population, according to the stats. Average age, or the median age, so half the sample is older, half the sample is younger. That's what the median is. Very, very similar. And so the first question I want to talk about is substances used any time at the festival. So remember, some people were there only a day or two, and some people had been there several days. And so putting together the two surveys. So that's the 2009 survey where we actually did the community sample. And this is the 2013 one where we're sampling from the lineup at Anchors. And the thing that, to me, that's remarkable is how incredibly similar the usage is. And so this suggests to me that the people who go to Anchors are a good representation of who's at Shambhala, and who's at Shambhala are not doing that much different from what the people who actually go to Anchors are doing. So you can see, fairly large proportion, more than 2/3 will use cannabis. Alcohol, considering it's an alcohol-free event and they search people, it's remarkable, testament to people's resourcefulness. And I think a lot of this is a testament to people's resourcefulness, and we really need to keep this idea front and center that people who use drugs need to be resourceful. It's not an easy thing to do, and they're not stupid, which I think is one of the memes in the popular media. So if we look at the last 24 hours, which is what really interests me, again, between the two surveys, not statistically significantly different. They're essentially very much the same. What's interesting, or maybe not, is some of the differences that you start to see coming up in terms of how things have changed over 4 years. So a lot more pot use. Alcohol is still where it was. And I think these differences probably have more to do with just subtle differences in the crowd, because clearly in the Anchors lineup we're going to get people who are active drug users. So when we look at the actual polysubstance use that was going on, and so use this term simultaneous polysubstance use referring to the 24 hours, the thing that I find really interesting about this is that this is from the community sample and this is from the Anchors sample. It's not that much different. What is different is when you look at this end where people are using 5 or more substances in 24 hours. And I think this is what's changing, is that more and more and more people are using more and more substances. So initially you might think, or I showed this data to somebody, they might be like, oh my God, those people are crazy reckless. But what's interesting is, on my survey, I also collected total amount of drugs used in 24 hours. And the amounts were really small. So it's not that people are doing the same amount of ecstasy they would have done when they were just doing ecstasy and now doing also that amount of alcohol like they would do if they were only drinking, and so on and so on. People are using fairly small amounts of the individual things, and there's clearly a very careful titration that's going on of a person's state and energy level and so on. And so one of the things, what's the next one? Okay, yeah. So one of the things I noticed, I haven't got a slide on this, so I needed to cut a whole lot out. But when you actually look at the combinations people are using, I assumed that there would be some favored combinations, that people actually did polysubstance use. Because I think back to when I used to like to get psychedelic, I like to do acid and mushrooms together, or mushrooms and pot. And I actually thought of it in terms of those two things. But it turns out when you look at the combinations that people are doing, it's no different from just a random combining. In fact, there was no particular combination that stood out, except for maybe alcohol and pot, which really were the people who weren't doing anything else. So what that suggests to me is that polysubstance use is not something that people do. It's just something that happens. It's what the picture ends up looking like. And so I think that's an important thing to think about, because if you talk to people as if this is a strategy that they have to combine things, they might not see themselves as being in your audience. But the vast majority of people actually do end up mixing drugs, and so this is clearly important. Alcohol and cannabis are the absolute backbones, so no surprise there. I suppose one small surprise is that the alcohol is so ubiquitous, which does suggest a change from, say, over the last 20 years from the party drug people being a different crowd from the drinkers to being the same crowd. Yeah, overall small doses, and I think it's more of a diversification than an intensification of use. So from the qualitative, I got these ideas of what might be good questions to ask. And so the questionnaire had some scales in it that said, how important are these things to you when you're going to get high? And how much do you agree or disagree with statements? There were 2 sections. So I'm going to cover a few of those. So maybe completely unsurprisingly, the music, the location, and all of that matters. I don't think that's particularly surprising. But this is to be very interesting. So the question was asking for agreement, disagreement with a statement that the drugs are easy to buy is something that impacts people, or that there's free drugs available, because free drugs was definitely a big theme that came out of the interviewing. And as you can see, that people will at least say that that's not terribly important to them, and only for like a third of the people responded that this was important to either of the 2 questions. So I think that goes a little bit against maybe some of the current conceptualization of how this actually happens. I asked some questions around agency. To what degree is your decision to use related to the headspace you're in, and to what degree is it related to what the people, your friends are pressuring you to do? And I think what's interesting here is, the idea this would be reversed if you believe the popular notion of peer pressure. So I would suggest that there's a number of things that suggest peer pressure just does not work the way that it's sort of popularly conceptualized. So I think this is what it's really about, because people talked a lot about being on the same vibe as their friends. They talked about the strategies they used for what drugs they took with them, what they ended up taking when they got to a venue, and so on. It was all about being on the same vibe as their friends. And I asked separately about being on the same vibe as your friends and on the same vibe as other people. And so friends obviously take precedence here, but there was an interesting gender difference. The guys tended not to really care at all about what was going on in the environment, but the female participants were much more concerned about being on the same vibe as other people in the environment. I don't mean to gender stereotype, that just was in the data. So some of the questions I asked were around factors that might influence people in terms of what happens if things go bad. And so one question was, if I got too high or drunk, my friends would take care of me, and then ask for agreement, disagreement. And the connections you make with people when you're high are genuine and last after you're not high anymore. And what's interesting here is that there's a fairly substantial amount of agreement with that. And then I asked some questions around needs and planning. And do you have to be high in order to have a good time? And do you have a plan and stick to it? And I think what's interesting here is a lot of people said they don't need to be high or drunk to have a good time. And a lot of people said they have some sort of plan that they stick to. Which I think those are, if they're even partially true, those are both fairly optimistic statements in terms of being able to make a difference. So when we look at the harm reduction services that ANCHOR's provided, and I put this one in case any of you are thinking of what, I only have limited resources, what could I do at the festival I'm going to organize? Pill and powder testing was clearly very, very popular. And we asked people, what did you use this Shambhala? What did you use, any of the times you've been here? Checking anchors out. Essentially, this was just coming to the anchor stand to ask about what's going on. Look at the information board and so on. What is interesting is that people were not going there to report bad drugs or bad trips. I think probably because the sanctuary is a more appropriate place for that. And people were not really big on the information pamphlets. They actually would rather engage face-to-face with somebody. So if you don't have a lot of money and you can't afford to buy the bucket card, down-safe cards and things like that, I think don't worry about it. So we also asked a question, tell us the one main thing you do to keep yourself healthy and safe at the festival. Almost I think all but one person answered this, and people put a lot of care into their answers, which was wonderful. And what was interesting was that a lot of people talked about pacing. And I think that is important if you are going to mix a lot of drugs and you are now going to party, say, for a whole weekend, or if you're at a festival and you're going for several days, is to think about pacing. People talked about the buddy system, and by this they meant either not doing drugs alone, not going out alone, telling their friends what they were doing so that people knew what they were on, sharing whatever they had, and so on, sharing snacks, sharing water, and so on. And I think that this is definitely something that we can foster. People talked about using pill and powder testing and having a reliable or trusted source, which seems fairly reasonable. So we also asked, are there any additional harm reduction services you want? And there were lots and lots of suggestions, but a quarter of them referred to the pill and powder testing, and really they just wanted better testing, better isolation of tests to try and make up for the fact that the tests we have are such crude tests. But really, what a lot of people wanted was quantitative testing, accurate quantitative testing. So I want to talk a little bit about this idea of skillful psychonauts. If you're going to do harm reduction work, I think this is a good way to conceive of the people you're addressing, either implicitly or explicitly. So you can either encourage them to be skillful psychonauts, or you could just assume that they are, or that they could be. And this term, psychonaut, has been around for quite a while, and yeah, this part doesn't really matter. I just think it's a really cool idea. This idea that what people are engaging in is a purposeful activity and that they're actually going to draw something lasting from it. So, building on this idea of the skillful psychonaut, what are the properties? I think responsible and caring, this hedonistic and experience seeking. I think it's really important not to lose sight of the fact that this is about fun and sensory experience and so on. Group-oriented and community-aware, so this idea of thinking about who you're with, what they're doing, what you're doing, sharing that information with others, and the fact that there really is this sense, and it's a sense that people have or report, and I think can be built on, that they're part of a community. When you're engaged in the festival scene or the party scene, you're part of a community. So, that says I talked too long already, so I'll wrap quickly so we can get to questions. In terms of alcohol and cannabis, what came out of the data is that this really now is front and center. And I think alcohol often gets left out when we think about substance use, and often we just think about the pills and powders. And for a variety of reasons, people reported a lot of preloading, getting drunk before they go out, because they can't really afford the expensive, incredibly weak drinks in a bar. So what they would do is buy one drink and then take ketamine instead, because then they can feel drunk, but it's much cheaper, because $5 of ketamine will get you about as far as $60 worth of liquor in a bar, and so on. Cannabis is really very interesting because of this sort of quasi weird legal status of it right now. And so I think that for certainly a lot of young people, they think that it's harmless because of that. And it's actually not necessarily so, and it's certainly the least harmless for people when they first start using it in their teenage years. And I think people talk about gateway drugs, but honestly, alcohol is the gateway drug. And so I think we need to push back when people say, oh, ecstasy is a gateway drug. It's not, it's alcohol. Like, alcohol is everywhere. That's where it starts, this whole thing about learning about altering your mood state. I think that one of the lessons to be drawn from the stuff around polysubstance use is that we don't need to focus so much on the specific molecules, either from the perspective of research or from the perspective of learning. And if you are going to help people, you don't have to have an encyclopedic knowledge of all these different drugs. And the truth is that there's just too many new ones to keep up with. And it's part of this sort of trench warfare. As they schedule a drug, they say, this chemical compound with this formula and molecular weight is now illegal. Somebody adds a methyl group on it, it's now a different compound with a different weight. It's no longer illegal, but you can still get a buzz off it. And sometimes it's stronger, and sometimes it's got worse side effects. But as long as there is prohibition, this battle is going to go on. And I think the truth is that, when you buy ecstasy, a lot of the research treats ecstasy as if somehow it was a chemical, like a 100% pure, chemical X. And the truth is it's a combination of who knows what. And so there's a sense in which if you say, well, I don't engage in polysubstance use, I just use E. E is a polysubstance. So I think that's important. And then the interactions that are going on in the body are adding this whole other layer. So even if you did master this encyclopedic knowledge of how these drugs work and what they do, you're going to miss this whole other piece. And there's not a lot of information out there on it. I think that in terms of drug education and in terms of strategies, we need to focus more on mixing. And I'd like to, if you haven't seen this, go to the TripSit wiki. If you just put TripSit drug combination matrix, it's the first link that comes up. It's this fabulous matrix. I'd love to know some of the research behind it that lists a whole variety of combinations and then color codes them in terms of whether they're known to be safe, probably safe, known to be somewhat harmful, known to be seriously harmful, and so on. I think just being aware of interactions may be new information for some people. And as I mentioned, talking about E, that it's not, to some degree, this isn't really something new, because your strategies for mixing drugs is not really different for your strategy for just taking E that's who knows what. So speed up a bit now. So I think what we need to do is really focus on the getting high, on the behavior, on what people are doing, rather than on the sort of specific tools and things that they're using for it. So instead of thinking about doing drugs or using drugs, think about getting high, because that's the bigger picture of what's going on. In terms of research, I think that we really need to look more at the actual phenomenology of getting high, of partying and so on, and not just assume somehow that it's an obvious and well understood activity that doesn't really need to be factored into substance use. And we definitely need a lot more research on what's happening with these different chemicals in your body at the same time. In terms of services, I think obviously there's a huge demand for pill testing, and I think if you have it, it will be used. We really would love to get to doing full quantitative testing. Safe disposal and amnesty bins. So one of the things at Shambhala was a lot of people, when they discover their pill doesn't have what they think is in it, they want to get rid of it. And so Shambhala worked out an arrangement with the RCMP and so on in order to arrange for safe disposal. And so I think this is, there's a precedent that's been set, there's a protocol that can be followed, and I think that this is something we should think about, is how to provide safe disposal. We don't want pills out where somebody can inadvertently, especially a young kid, take them. We don't want to chuck them down the toilet. So I think that's important. And the idea of amnesty bins, that there's a place where you could just get rid of stuff, and even in the cop shop have an amnesty bin. You could just go dump it. It's like a free pass if you go there. I think sanctuaries are really important. And then, as I mentioned, more information about mixing, but with a focus on benefit maximization, not all about, all these terrible things can go wrong. But on, here's how, if you do it, you'll have a healthier experience, and you'll be able to get more of what you want with less of what you don't want. For people who like to get high and those who love them, I really would like to promote this idea of the skillful psychonaut. And I think that there's a lot that we can build on in terms of the networks, the community values of taking care of each other, the old plur values, peace, love, unity, and respect, much mocked, still very true. Something that we really recommend at parties and things that we've organized in the past is that people let other people know what they're on. There's still a lot of shame and stigma about certain substances, even in communities that are very, very avid drug users. So everyone I interviewed who talked about cocaine was like, oh, but I didn't actually buy it, and I don't normally use it. And there was so much shame wrapped up in coke that was quite funny. And then a lot of people will not disclose their methamphetamine use. I don't think it's that widely used now outside of very distinct circles, but still there is shame on it. And so, we shouldn't think that because we're inside a drug-using community that somehow there aren't layers of stigma and stuff going on. So the idea about full disclosure is that you tell your friends what you're on. That way, if something goes wrong, they can tell, the ambulance person, or they could tell somebody who might know what to do, and so on. And so if you're hiding what you're doing, that's going to make it very difficult. And particularly if you're somebody who does GHB, it's really, really, really important you let people know that you're doing GHB, because with GHB, there's no bottom if you overdose. Ketamine, the others, the worst that will happen is you'll have a long sleep and you'll be fine. But with GHB, it can end up in the ground. So if you disclose about nothing else, tell people if you're going to use GHB. And I think that there's more we can learn about the consequences of mixing, of overheating, and serotonin syndrome. If you don't know what serotonin syndrome is, Google it. Worth knowing. For policymakers, Ken insisted I put this one in, so thank you, Ken. I think we really need to have quantitative street drug testing. And what's interesting is the BC government called for this in 2005 as a policy recommendation. It's not been enacted yet. Honest drug education, hugely important. If we tell kids, smoke one joint and you're going to be in the gutter as an addict, and they see everyone around them smoking a joint, they're not going to believe a thing we tell them. And people draw on their own experiences, so if you tell them horror stories and that's not their experience, they're not really going to listen to anything else you say. I've mentioned a couple of the others, and I think this is a longer-term project, but a lot of the harms associated with substance use have to do with the fact that the substances are so sketchy. If you could get your MDMA from a chemist and know what you were getting, you'd probably avoid a lot of the harm associated with the MDMA use. It would be a whole different world. And so I think from the perspective of goals, not about doing less, it's about healthier gatherings. I think appropriating the language of health is a very useful thing to structure our thinking, and also in terms of having more neutral discussions with people who maybe are not so keen on this. And I think the idea should not be to get people to do less or have a not so strong experience, but just about less problematic outcomes. I mean, the most ideal is you have the most perfect experience you want with absolutely nothing bad happening at all. Yeah, so some final thoughts. I think one of the questions I was asked before I did the interview this morning was they said to me, well, is the goal no drug use? Do you think it's important that people use drugs? And the truth is that except for the Inuit, is that right, Ken? Except for the Inuit, every culture that we know of that has left any kind of evidence behind has used substances, alcohol, mushrooms, all sorts of things. Psychedelic or mind-altering things are part of the human condition. And I think it is important that people have an opportunity to kind of transcend their, modest embodied existence and so on. Yeah, so there's lots of people have supported my work. Lots of people have given me money, for which I'm very grateful, or given us money to do some of the research, and then all the people who've actually participated in the research to whom I'm really, really grateful.